Hello class, and welcome to this Prezi on annotated bibliographies. I know what you're thinking. Oh my god, I hate writing annotated bibliographies and they are so hard, but actually the opposite is true. They're actually really easy because we're good at summarizing and evaluating. We do it all the time. We're telling our friends about the new series on Netflix. We summarize what it's about and we tell them how good it is or bad it is, right? Same thing with annotated bibliographies. We just do it in writing and we do it for sources. So that's all. It's as easy as that, I promise you. In fact, that's what this next slide is all about. So don't freak out. Anytime I mention annotated bibliographies, even to like grad students, they just freeze and they just don't like it. And I feel like annotated bibliographies are easier to write than essays because essays do have like all the components, like an introduction, a thesis, topic sentences, transitions, points to be made, conclusions, whereas annotated bibliographies are basically just a list of sources and then an evaluation and a summary of those sources. That's it. That's all there is to it. But to prove to you that this is true, let's go through this Prezi. Okay, so like I said, an annotated bibliography is basically a document that is a list of sources. It is formatted in MLA style. So, the reference page you have at the end of an essay that has your references listed, it's basically that. The only difference is we're including paragraphs with each of our entries that summarize and evaluate. But as we'll see in the next slide, there are some other options too. But yeah, basically we're just writing 150 words underneath each citation to let the reader know what we found, how it's useful. So there are 4 types of annotation paragraphs. So when I say summarize and evaluate, those are the most common. So the textbook talks about indicative, and the first type of annotated paragraph being indicative. And this is when basically you just tell the reader what the source is about and what the main ideas are. So summary, right? The second one that the textbook talks about is informative. And this is where you summarize the argument, you summarize the thesis of the work, the primary assertions, the evidence, and the conclusion. So I guess we could say indicative is just a little bit more broad. It's just the main ideas of the source, whereas informative is more like how the source is written and how the source is working. Either way, it's all about summary. So we're not going to get too picky about that. And then a third type of annotation paragraph is evaluation. And this is where we summarize the arguments and the conclusion. And again, it's all about summary and evaluate, right? But basically for the evaluative, we want to talk about how that source is useful for our project that we're working on, or how it will be useful and how we used it. So yeah, basically it's just, is this source good or bad? How are you going to use it? How did they make their arguments and were they good? So you get to think in terms of being a judge and determining how that source is going to work for you. The third one, and this is on my face, is a combo. So you could have any combo of these 3. But again, what it comes down to is basically summarize, evaluate. Those are the two main steps to an annotated bibliography. And perhaps your teacher will just have you summarize. They might not have you evaluate. Maybe they'll have you evaluate, but they won't have you summarize. Either way, those are kind of the broad strokes. So see, no freaking out. It's really easy. So here are the reasons why we write annotated bibliographies. We want to have a compiled list of sources that you can use later. So the argument, essay, or inquiry project is broken down into 2 parts. The first part is gathering research and writing the annotated bibliography. Bam, that's the first part. So then when it comes time to actually write the argument, you already have your sources, you've already thought about them and evaluated them. And then you can pick your top 3 or 4 or however many you're going to use. And those are on your list already. You've already thought about them. And you can move forward having done that step already. We're all about taking steps to make the process easier. Another reason why we write annotated bibliographies is to help you decide if you want to return to a source later in the process. So again, we're going to start with an annotated bibliography. And once we get further into the process, your research question is going to change. It's going to morph. And so when you go back to your sources, you're going to have those summaries and those evaluations to look at again. So maybe 2 weeks from having written the annotated bibliography, you are writing your argument and you go back and you're like, oh, this source, right, I forgot that it had that component. And that's because you had the chance to write the annotated bibliography to keep track of your sources. An annotated bibliography also helps you develop your own thesis, because what you write in your summaries and evaluations might help determine which way you're going to go for your thesis, whether it's going to be arguing for or against something related to that topic. But just the process of summarizing and evaluating the sources is going to help you formulate your paper and what path you're going to take. So that's why we do this. The last reason why is that it can help you create a literature review. Some of you who might be going on in education might have to write a literature review, but basically a literature review is an annotated bibliography. It's related sources and reviews of those sources so that other people can have a compilation of what's out there related to their topic. So probably won't do a lot with the literature review, but the first 3 are very, very good reasons to write an annotated bibliography, if you're not convinced already. We're still not freaking out, right? Okay, so here are the steps to writing an annotated bibliography. First and foremost, you need to pick a research question, because that's going to dictate what kind of sources you're going to find. And we will go over research techniques in another Prezi or PowerPoint, who knows. So yeah, first things first, what are you going to research? Is your research question, could we pay college athletes? That's a great question. That's going to be our first step, because then that'll lead us to step 2. Now we're going to go gather materials. So we're going to find as many reliable materials as we can. So if the assignment calls for 5 reliable sources, let's hopefully get to 7 or 8, because at this point we want to work with abundance. It's always easier to have too much and narrow down than to not have enough and to scramble later. I promise you that. And the textbook talks about that too. So we have a research question picked out about, is it feasible to pay college athletes? Next, we're going to go onto the library databases or Google Scholar. And if those don't work, we're going to go to just Google itself, and we're going to gather our materials through some strategic searching. Step 3 is reading strategically. So we have a question in mind, something about whether it's feasible to pay them. Now we are going to read the materials that we found. So if we found 8 materials, we're going to read each of them with the focus of discovery. So what can I discover about this topic? We're not going in already thinking, okay, I already know that it's feasible and I'm going to prove it. At this point, we're just asking the question, is it feasible? And we're going to keep an open mind, because otherwise we're going to see what we think we want, and we're going to probably ignore some evidence that is actually there. So be open-minded. Suspend the critical thinker. Step 4, after you have read each of your materials and you've gotten a feel for them enough to be able to summarize and evaluate, the next step is to create that MLA reference entry for each of those sources. So you have your 8 sources, you're going to do your MLA reference entry for each. Let's use the generators, y'all. They're great. We're not living in the time when I had to do this and I had to do it all by hand and it was from a book. So here are a couple of the options for you, and these will be linked in the checklist or the content or both. If you haven't used them already, yeah, they're amazing. If you have used them, great, you already know. But if you haven't used them yet, just go onto the websites and enter the information they're asking for to create the reference entry, and it will generate it for you. They're amazing. Okay, so step 5 then, the last part, is composing your annotation for each of those MLA reference entries. So each of your 8 sources has an MLA reference entry generated by one of those generators. Now you're going to compose the 150-word paragraph for each of those 8 reference entries. And again, we are going to summarize the source that you found. What is the source trying to say? And then evaluate. How good is the source? How well did they do their research? How will it work for you? Here are some questions to help you write your annotated bib paragraphs, those annotated paragraphs. This is in your textbook, and I only have 4 minutes left in this video, so we won't go through them, but here are some things to help you evaluate. Who is the intended audience for the article, book, or review? What central research question or claim does the material address? So by answering these questions, you can put them right into your paragraph. These are super helpful. So go back to Appendix C and take a look at those. Oh, okay. We do have a couple more minutes. Let's take a look at some of these. Okay, so number 3 here, what kind of evidence is used to support the conclusions that the author of your source came to, the argument and the thesis, and how valid is the evidence they provided, given what the intended audience values? For example, literary examples wouldn't be taken seriously as evidence in a biology paper, and you wouldn't want anecdotal evidence about an experiment. Or how effectively has the author addressed the central question or claim? So if you're doing the research question, should college athletes be paid, you can ask about source number 1. How effectively did they answer that question? Maybe they answered it in full and you're like, hey, I got my answer from this one source. This one source is really thorough. Your evaluation in that paragraph would reflect that. And you'd say what was valuable about it. Maybe they went off topic. Maybe they said, could college athletes be paid? And instead they go into pro athletes and they don't go back to the college athletes. This is your chance by asking this question to determine that, no, it wasn't good. And that's what you get to put in your annotated bibliography paragraph for that source. You can say, this was not a good source. It didn't include this. It won't be useful for my materials. Or how credible is the author? Have you seen his or her name appear in other works or published in any other area of expertise? That's something to consider too. So all of these questions are going to help you determine the value and the effectiveness of each of your sources. And that's what's going to be the last half of your annotated paragraphs. Okay, so no freaking out, right? This is really actually very simple. You go and get your MLA references generated for each of your sources, and then you just write 150 words telling us, what is this source about? How is it different than the other ones? And then evaluate it. Was it useful? Was the information helpful? Did they have good research methods? And then how is it going to be used for your research? Is it going to be helpful for your research or not? What are you going to take from that source, and what are you going to leave out? Okay, that's it. We're going to bust this out and it's going to be great. Please let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, we will see you next time. Bye, everybody.